Um, let's see. What changes took place in Hebrew culture as a result of their Babylonian exile?
Well, when Cyrus of Persia captured Babylon and took over that whole empire, he allowed the Hebrews to return to Israel and rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. But there were so many people who lived in Babylon and they had homes, they had families. They were not about to go. The young people are not the ones that went. It was the older people who went, who wanted to go back to their homeland. And they rebuilt the temple and tried to get people to help them. They left the poor behind so they could farm the land and still produce food to give to Cyrus. But actually, no, that's okay.
You want your water?
No. So, Cyrus of Persia was very clever. Most emperors of that time were very foolish because they would keep their captives and make slaves out of them, but he was very smart. He decided, no, if I let them go back home and farm their own land, which I own, they have to pay tribute to me, and they're going to be more productive. I won't have to feed them in my empire. If I let them go back there, let them grow the crops and send them back to me. So I think he was very, very smart.
Okay, and when were the Hebrews in Babylonian? Babylonian? Yeah. Babylon, I should say.
Yeah, Babylon. Well, the first deportation took place about 722 BCE, and that would have been Assyria, when Assyria came in and took the northern kingdom of Israel. Then about 536 BCE, the Babylonians came in. They had defeated the Assyrians, so they came in and carried everybody off to Babylon. And so then they came back to rebuild their temple, and that was after Cyrus allowed them to go back home. So that's the time element.
So as far as cultural influence from the Babylonians to the Hebrews, maybe language, so there was some language transferred there, there were some stories.
Yes,
the Hebrews.
most of the people, the average person did not speak Hebrew. Hebrews was limited to the priests and the higher clergy, and they made sure they were the only ones that could understand scripture. And the regular people were just allowed to listen to what the priests had to say. They might pick up a word here and there, but they could not read them because most people couldn't afford them. There weren't that many copies of scrolls around of Torah, and so they just had to rely on what the priest would tell them. And it wasn't until later on when Ezra came, that's why he's called the great emancipator, so something like Lincoln. He freed the people up to listen to scripture and encouraged them to read it for themselves. And of course, a lot of them couldn't read or write, but the people who could afford an education could do that. They could go to after the captivity, there was the synagogue, and that took place in captivity. Before that, they had the temple. Once they moved and went into captivity, there was no temple anymore. No temple, no king, no empire, nothing. So how could they meet and keep up their Hebrew status, so to speak? So they started meeting in homes, and then that's when they realized what they needed to do was to write down their scripture. So you see, nothing was really written down, everything was oral tradition. It wasn't until the priests got together and decided to pull everything together that they had a Torah. So it was really the priests who decided what went into the Torah. And that's why there's a lot of things in there that are borrowed.
And some of them borrowed from the Babylonians.
Borrowed from Babylonians, Persians, borrowed from the Egyptians. All the names changed in the stories to make them Hebrew stories, which is a whole different study.
Right, interesting.
Especially the Psalms. If you go through the Psalms, you can see by reading them the pagan influences. You can see where they came from. You can tell whether they're Egyptian or not. I first became aware of that when I had to study ancient Near Eastern texts. And all of a sudden when I looked, I saw, hey, that's from Psalm 86. Hey, they took this from Psalm. No, it was just the other way around. The psalmist took it from the Egyptians because the Egyptians were more ancient.
Right.
After all, they were older culture.
It would almost stand to reason, though, if the Hebrews were in exile, living in that culture for so long, they're bound to borrow stories, just like Marco Polo
Right.
taking
Exactly.
spices from the east when he traveled. The
That's
Hebrews are going to take their stories.
Exactly.
And it sounds like Ezra the Emancipator was a lot like Martin Luther later.
Yes, he was. Yes. In fact, some of them call him, some of the Hebrews think that he's a greater influence than Moses, for instance, because of what he accomplished. But he was very harsh. He insisted that all the men, not the women so much, but any man who had married a pagan had to divorce her, had to get rid of her, because they wanted to keep the strain pure. They didn't want any intermarriage. That's why they hated the Samaritans, because they intermarried. Samaritans did that while they were in captivity. While the Hebrews were in captivity, the Samaritans were mingling and watering down the breed, so to speak. And when they came back and found these half-breeds wanting to worship in their temple, they said, no way, out.
Interesting. As you see it, what is the conflict between the current differences between the Israelis and the Palestinians? What is their basic conflict that they cannot
The conflict
resolve?
is land, of course. The whole issue is land. And because the Hebrews point to their scripture as having the first right to the land, it's their type of propaganda. It really is propaganda, because they wrote the book and said that God wanted them to have it. Whereas the Palestinians point to Muhammad in the Quran and say, God wanted us to have it.
But of course, Muhammad and the Quran came so much later.
Not till 600 AD.
Right. Do you see a way that they could resolve their conflict?
No, I don't think so.
Because some of it is religious as well.
It's all religious.
Yeah, not just the land, I mean.
But the land is tied up with the religion, because the religion of the Hebrews tells them that the land is theirs through Scripture. That's the only claim they give. When in fact they stole it from the Canaanites who were there, and the Palestinians were Canaanites. They're called Palestinians today, but they're the original Canaanites. They're descended from them. And also, I think as I told you, Arab means half-breed. So Hebrews want to keep theirs. They like their girls to marry Jewish men, and Jewish men want to marry Jewish women. They want in Israel. But of course, that's not happening. There's a lot of intermarriage going on, and the old school doesn't like it. The Orthodox Jews don't like that.
Can you explain a little bit about the Orthodoxy and, for instance, the difference between a contemporary Jew and a Hasidic Jew?
Oh yes, the most extreme is the Hasidic Jew. They have the curls down the side, which is a carryover from gleaning in the fields. It's their sacrifice to God. They won't cut that off. They'll let that grow as long as possible. Also long beards and so forth. And they're very strict. They wear hats. But the next is the Orthodox, and ortho means right. Orthodoxy is right, the right way to do something, and that's for that religion. Then you have the conservative Jew, who still clings to the old ways, but makes a few changes. For instance, facing the congregation and having classes and the cantor. But then you go to the Reformed Jew, and that's what's happening in America is the Reformed Jew, and that's why Reformed Judaism is not catching on in Israel. But in America, it's rampant. I know in Milwaukee we may have 50 synagogues which are all Reformed Jews. And they have guitar. They've introduced the guitar music like the churches have. And the cantor sings very modern stuff, and sometimes in Yiddish, which is frowned upon.
Wait, why is that? What is Yiddish then?
Yiddish is a cross between German and Hebrew.
Oh,
In English, it's a combination of all kinds of strange things, but it's not pure. And that's why the Jews really want to keep it pure, trying to keep that strain. And they've been very successful at it, or they wouldn't still be here 3,000 years later.